Behind me is an area of northern Nevada near the Oregon border called Kelley Creek, and this is one of the most remote areas of the country, and it was here in February of 1911 that the last known Indian massacre at the hands of U.S. authorities actually took place. And the story here begins around spring of 1910 when Mike Daggett, who was a sub-chief of the Shoshone Bannock people on Fort Hall Reservation, decided to lead about 11 people, 8 of which being his family, over across the prairie, the high desert, and to camp out on the border of California and Nevada. And their plan was simply to hunt along the way and set up camp in one of the canyons there. But around January, they started getting very hungry, and they knew that they wouldn't be able to survive the entirety of the winter without actually going out and slaughtering a cattle. So they did this, Mike Daggett and 2 of his sons, and a Basque sheep herder just so happened to see them. So the sheep herder sent for help from the local authorities in California, and the sheriff there decided to deputize 3 people to form a posse who arrived to deputize the Basque immigrant, and then they went to confront Mike Daggett and his 2 sons at the ranch. And this posse of 3 men, plus the sheep herder that was later recruited, was recruited around the area of Sunset Valley, California. And they stretched right over the border into Nevada in order to pursue Mike Daggett and his 2 sons who had slaughtered the cattle. And it was said that it's very likely that Daggett and his family were waiting for them, because they had been shot from the ridges of the area where they had shot the cattle from in a style that was very similar to ways that the army had actually killed Shoshone before. There was a very famous massacre which took place in Idaho that did just this. And so Mike Daggett and his 2 sons went back to their family's camp and said, now the law is on us. But it was much bigger than what they believed, because only in the 1870s and 1860s there had been Bannock Wars and Snake Wars and Mattock Wars, and there was this fear that there was one last uprising of the native people here. So the local population didn't see this as cattle rustling, didn't see it as just Wild West outlaw. They saw it as a potential uprising of Native Americans. And so the sheriffs of all of these counties up here, as well as in California, and a lot of the military authorities, started issuing bounties for the Daggett family. They said, if you can kill Mike Daggett, we will give you a reward. And they believed that if they had reached, because the Daggetts were very clearly aiming for an area known as the Duck Valley Indian Reservation, which was home to the Shoshone Paiute people, they believed that the Daggetts were going to incite a rebellion there. But this is, of course, not true. They were seeking a place to hide out for a few months or years until the law blew over and they could make it back up to their family in Fort Hall and live out the rest of their lives quietly. Of course, everybody knew that this wasn't going to happen, and in spite of them covering over 200 miles in just a few weeks in weather that looks like what it does now, they were eventually found in an area along a creek bed, a place called Kelley Creek, which is where the massacre actually took place on February 25th, 1911. And I should make a minor correction from my previous video. The posse that was sent from California actually consisted of one man deputized by the sheriff, along with 3 Basque sheep herders who actually saw this take place. And on January 19th is when they entered the Daggetts camp, when they were killed in the manner which I specified. But it's important to note that the Bannock War happened in 1878. That was the Bannock Uprising, which was a sort of subset of the Shoshone people, which are linguistically and ethnically linked to the Bannock, as well as very culturally linked. And the area around where I'm at right now is ancestral homeland to the Shoshone people, the Bannock people, and the Northern Paiute people. So the people here, remember, this was only the late 1870s, and it had just turned 1911. So people here were very unnerved by this, and entire towns emptied out of people. And what people were left kept watch with rifles from their windows round the clock, and they actually had night watch. So the Daggett family was in way over their heads. They didn't realize that a dozen people would make it seem like there was an entire war, and a war is what the US authorities gave them. They sent countless people after them, probably a half-dozen posses that we know of, but one of them finally caught up to the Daggetts on February 25th. The posse which finally found him was led by a man by the name of J.P. Donnelly, which worked in some way with the Nevada police force. Along him were several officers, a few armed civilians, and the county coroner and physician. They initially found remains of a Daggett camp on February 13th of 1911, and using this they continued to follow the trail of the Daggett family for another 200 miles until February 25th. And in the period of time between February 13th and February 25th, winter had really begun to set in, and horrible winter storms had begun blowing over. And eventually they caught up with them at Kelley Creek, which is just behind me, in an area that is surrounded by flat land, but which forms a ridge. And they began fighting. As they approached, the Daggett family dug in and began hiding behind rocks and taking aim at the posse. One man by the name of Ed Hogle was killed, and we don't really know much about Ed Hogle's story, but we know he's from Eagleville, Nevada. And it must be said that Mike Daggett died almost immediately in this battle, which prompted a 3-hour-long exchange between his family and authorities. And it must also be said that there may have been some form of surrender, which was not accepted by authorities, because 2 of the children, the very young children, were found shot dead. And it's very likely that they were massacred, because, again, authorities simply remarked that they were, quote, shot inadvertently. So probably someone tried to surrender and the authorities continued firing, so they depleted their ammunition for 3 hours. And by the end of this, when they had no bullets left, they began charging with tomahawks, throwing spears, and launching arrows at the authorities. And what was left was only one 16-year-old Daggett girl and 3 very small infant children. They sent these children off to adoption for a couple of years before sending them to an Indian school whose philosophy was to, quote, kill the Indian, save the man. Within 1 year, all but one of the children was dead, and she lived to be 82 years old when she died in Oregon after they gave her the wrong medication at the old person's home.